Okay. My wife, Kathy, my children, Katie and Ryan, my soon-to-be son-in-law, Ben, and my parents, Isabel and Larry, have traveled some 3,000 miles to be here with me today. Thank you for your support. I love you, and God bless you. Alan, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's truly a great honor. I, too, would like to thank the FSIR Foundation for their support of the Daughter Lecture. I come from a family of business people. My father's a retired corporate executive. Both of my brothers have MBAs. In fact, the only other doctor in my family, which I'm going to have to go back over here and get the clicker wherever it is. Oh, here it is. Great. Okay, that's my first misstep. The only other doctor in my family, Sumner Rhodes, graduated from Geneva Medical College, that's SUNY Upstate now, in 1840. Needless to say, IR was not his specialty. But when I was researching him for this talk, I came across this, and I thought, this is karma, because I, too, am talking about competition. I've always been interested in business and the business of medicine, and my family has done their best to understand our world. One memorable conversation centered around declining Medicare reimbursement, and these captains of industry told me we simply needed to raise prices. Well, needless to say, we've had some interesting conversations. I'd like to shape today's presentation as a micro-MBA focused on competition. In researching this talk, I interviewed interventional radiologists from highly successful practices and leaders from industry, and I read a bunch of books I never would have even looked at before in the bookstores until this past year. Now, one caveat, I'm not going to tell you anything here today that hasn't been said by other annual meeting speakers and daughter lecturers. Rather, I'm going to ask you to take a look at the same circumstances in a completely different light. In 2012, John Kaufman challenged us to learn more about ourselves by examining how our competitors perceive us. By the end of today's talk, I'm hoping that you'll begin to look at us as the competition rather than looking at them as the competition. Every daughter lecturer feels a need to bring Charles' daughter into the conversation in some way, and I'm certainly no exception, but here it's a bit more difficult because those who knew him well tell me he wasn't particularly competitive at work. And let's face it, he didn't really need to be. He was surrounded by untapped opportunities, so-called blue water in today's business speak. It does strike me that Daughter was a little bit more competitive in his private life with his love of mountain climbing and fast cars. But what strikes me most about Daughter's input into today's conversation is this. Daughter knew all about competition. He gave us the toolkit for competing successfully in IR decades before we even knew we needed it. His famous quote about clinical care has graced so many Daughter lectures, you probably all know it by heart. And I'm pleased to say, as I stand here today, that the vast majority of us are now walking this walk, and we're all much better competitors as a result. Daughter also taught us we needed admitting privileges, something without which we could not possibly compete. Interestingly, he taught us what not to do, specifically stating that credentials battles were a waste of time and merely slowed the pace of change. Now, as many of you know, in business school, a staple is the case. And our micro-MBA is going to be no exception to that. I'll present this one first as an unknown. Imagine a group of competitors, a field in where you have one that's dominating. Among the competitive strategies used by the others is to copy the leader's name. The leader responds with protectionist strategies, which work for a while, but eventually one of the others manages to rise to the top, getting around those strategies. The former leader drops back, remakes itself, and then comes roaring back to once again dominate the field. If this sounds familiar, it should, and I'll come back to it in a little bit. Those conversations with my family, I repeatedly maintained that medicine and business were different, and that the rules of business didn't apply to us, or at least not in the same way. Now, this may be true, but one thing's for sure, we are by no means exempt from the need to compete, and to do so fiercely. This was brought home to me rather pointedly in the 1990s by my friend and IU dermatology chair, Evan Farmer. Evan was also chair of the Credentials Committee and had helped me get admitting privileges over stiff opposition from other specialists. Once again, Daughter knew. While Evan was extracting his pound of flesh, I was whining about ongoing competitive forces that were changing the face of IR. He listened patiently and then asked me, Scott, do you really think IR has a monopoly on competition? Look at this lesion I'm taking off your nose. It's laid claim to by no less than 3 different specialties, ENT, derm, and plastic, with others waiting in the wings. Medicine is a business like any other. And in business thrives on competition. Well, this was a tremendous wake-up call for me, and one for which I'm forever indebted to Dr. Farmer. Incidentally, and perhaps poetically, he now works in industry. Well, this brings me to the first key point of this talk. Let's get the T word out of the lexicon. We've all used it before, and almost always in a negative way. You hear it here at the annual meeting, in sidebar conversations, and here on the podium. How many times did you hear it this week? This word cloud, generated from the brand new FSIR membership survey, tells us just how much the word continues to dominate our thoughts. Well, my son Ryan has a pat response to anybody saying there's no I in team. He says, yes, but there is me in team. Well, similarly, there's no IR in turf, or if you prefer, turf is a four-letter word. Either way, let's stop using the word, and instead, let's talk about competition, because there most definitely is an IR in competitor. I'm pleased to say that at least in this forum, mention of the word competition has begun to dwarf that of the T word. This is excellent progress, and a pattern we need to adopt in our own lives. Now, interestingly, some daughter lecturers have gone so far as to say we shouldn't try to compete, that we're outnumbered, or we should continue to try to find blue water. Well, let's examine that for a second. Aside from the obvious fact that there's a lot less blue water out there today than there was in Dotter's time, competition makes us better. Monopolies, even so-called natural monopolies like the phone company, eventually disappear with time. Does anybody really think we'd be better off with a single telecom? The democratization of our work, and let's face it, folks, eventually all of it will be, means that we have to be creative, competitive, and agile, just like the telecoms of today. This is good for patients. Better access, better doctors, better research, better tools and techniques. All we have to do is stay in the mix to be successful. Now, Joseph Schumpeter created the term creative destruction, going on 100 years ago now, described as the process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. And I think it's very applicable to IR. Personal computers replacing mainframes is the most commonly used example of creative destruction. But there are so many parallels in our world, beginning with Seldinger's concept, which now forms the basis for all percutaneous and minimally invasive medicine. Another great example is ultrasound, having gone from a tool used by the select few to being hailed as the stethoscope of the 21st century. The point is, no specialty owns anything, whether they developed it or not. You get the idea. If it weren't for competition, we'd still be doing things the old-fashioned way and might have never have evolved into the IR clinicians of today. This key transition has been repeatedly emphasized in Dotter lectures and also by Dotter himself. This applies to our tools and techniques as well. Let's take recanalization devices, which have exploded in the endovascular era. A lot of older IR docs think all they need is an angled catheter and a hydrophilic wire. But for younger interventionalists and less experienced ones, these devices make it easier for them to be successful, thus leveling the playing field. You can bet our competitors are going to use them. Furthermore, the increased uptake fosters further innovation by industry. The cycle repeats itself, and we get more toys. This is a positive result of democratization. Conversely, protectionism stifles innovation, and besides, it doesn't work. Now, you might be saying, well, it's easy to stand up here and talk about competition, but can we really compete? And my response is an unequivocal, resounding yes. Not only can we compete, but we can do so even when the playing field is not entirely level. First of all, the history of IR is filled with competitive success stories, including venous access, as highlighted by Dan Pikus in 2013, UFE, which competes well with surgical alternatives, multiple areas of IO, venous ablation, and lots more. In fact, one could argue that virtually everything we do has been competed successfully for in some way or another. Yet, we all seem to be hung up on PAD, so let's take that one head on. I'm going to make the assumption that most of us think that PAD is something that we want to do more of. Therefore, we have to compete for it. Now, before I get to my example, I'd like to examine where we were with respect to PAD some 25 years ago. I would argue that at that time, we were not fully ready to compete. In fact, even in some very high-functioning practices, there are a few who are not ready to compete even today. At that time, we did have a monopoly on PAD work. It was our T word, and we thought we owned it. Yet, growth of PAD was stifled by a lack of uptake by vascular surgeons. They said our results were poor, and that bypass was better. Let's examine that for a moment. If I told you that a 4-year study of below-knee revascularization in 98 patients had a 100% technical success rate and an 86% 2-year limb salvage rate, how many of you would think that's a good result? I can't actually see your hands, so I'm going to assume that most of you are raising your hand right now. Well, would you be surprised if I told you this paper was published in 1988 by an interventional radiologist? The late Don Schwarten was not the only one publishing results this good. In the same issue of Radiology, Karen Brown had a similar paper with similar results. Yet there was little uptake of this limb-sparing approach. The endovascular revolution forever changed the perspective regarding PAD interventions, particularly infrainguinal ones. Shortly after former FSIR President Kathy Kroll decided her best way to compete for PAD work in her area was to join the vascular surgery group, she told me, and I quote, "All of a sudden the volume of PAD work has gone through the roof, and bypass is being done less and less." End quote. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why that was, but it's a fundamental underpinning of the PAD explosion. To quote the tired adage, if you love something, set it free. And PAD needed to be set free. Now, we heard a lot of talk about floating everyone's boat higher at that time. And float it did. Yet, we were not in that boat. And this brings me to the next key point of this talk. Sometimes, in competition, we lose. We just can't take it personally. In business, companies win and lose all the time. That's what competition is all about. A lot of us took it way too personally in the PAD battles. I know I did. But we just can't do that. Now, Bruce Brown's book, Compete, is really aimed at young athletes, but I think it's got a couple of good messages for us. One of these is this mantra of play, recover, play. Defining the cycle of competition. Win or lose, you bounce back, you go back in there and go after it again. The second key point is that the best competitors recover quickly. And this is definitely a page we could take from this short book. So let's take a look at that recovery. I will submit to you that PAD can and will once again be a big part of IR's history. Bob Vogelzang sums this up by saying, "We lost some battles, but we won the war." And folks, you can couch it any way you want, but it's there for the taking. All we have to do is roll up our sleeves and compete. At Penn, my partner Tim Clark applied a model he first used at NYU for competing for PAD work. It worked pretty well there, and when he reapplied the model at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center, it worked even better. Furthermore, my partner Mike Watts applied the same model at the Philadelphia VA with the same results. The point is, any of you can do this. Now, since this is a recorded talk, it would be foolhardy of me to stand here and divulge trade secrets, but I can tell you this. The model is based on being clinically strong, talented, aggressive, available, and willing. Does it sound like IR? Well, you bet it does. This is every bit circling back, riding somebody else's coattails for a change, and wading headlong into the red waters of PAD. Does it work? Take a look. When I got to Penn in 2001, we'd begun the same decline in PAD work that most of you have. But look at what's happened since at both the VA and Presbyterian. It looks like a miracle, but it's just sound competition. I'm sure Tim or Mike will be more than happy to give you some pointers as to how to make this happen in your own practice. Furthermore, industry has taken notice of this, and there's substantial rapprochement going on as they realize that we are players in PAD. They may have written us off in the past, but no longer. Folks, this is happening at the national level as well, although the curve's a bit flatter. IR docs are competing for PAD and doing so successfully. This doesn't happen on its own. We need to apply the tripartite skill set that John Kaufman discussed in 2012, and we need to do so aggressively. We need to be prepared to manage complications, which fortunately we're very good at. We need to be prepared to take transfers. Is your practice ready for this? Speaking with Frank Fascini from Chicago, whose practice competes very successfully for PAD work and other work, I asked him the pointed question, will you take transfers of sick patients for long stays? And the answer was an emphatic yes. Our competitors will do this without a moment's thought, and we need to do so as well. Fortunately, we're better poised than ever to do that. Now, before I move on, let's look at some other competitive success stories I came across in my research for this talk. The first of these was at Northwestern, where substantial competitive pressure was coming to bear in their filter practice. They made the creative decision to compete not for filter placement, but filter removal, and the Northwestern Filter Clinic was born. They played to their strength, knowing they could remove all or nearly all the filters, and it worked. Incidentally, filter placement is thriving. In another creative move, they used direct-to-patient radio advertising to compete for UFE work. And this, too, was highly successful. You can read about both of these in JVIR. Steve Smith created varicoseals.com, which has remained a bulwark against constant competitive threats to varicocele embolization for over 15 years and has generated referrals for IR docs worldwide. Thanks, Steve. Getting back to Frank Fascini's group, they've used detailed knowledge of the local market and hospitals' needs to craft a completely different business model for IR than the traditional one. And it works. This is just one example of their use of Porter's principles in a presentation to hospital administration. It's all about the business of medicine. At Innova in Alexandria, one of the many creative concepts they use is to see and examine every single patient in the vascular lab, essentially making it a clinic visit. They explain the results to the patient. I suspect this is completely different from the vascular lab you all know. Well, this approach plays on some strengths I've mentioned already and one I haven't yet, namely giving patients our time. Because we don't rely entirely on E&M revenue, we don't have to play the game of maximizing E&M coding in the shortest possible time. Patients love this. They want our time. They love the opportunity to ask and have answered questions. If you give them your cell phone number, they won't even believe it. And you can bet they will go home and tell their friends about their IR doc. The folks at Innova and others I spoke with are passionate about making sure the referring docs know they can call them for everything. These guys are really great competitors, and they have lots of other great ideas. Give Keith Sterling a call, and I'm sure he'll be happy to tell you more about it. At Minneapolis Radiology Associates, they realized early on that their best way to compete for PAD work was to hire vascular surgeons as equal partners. This has been extremely successful for them. And while it may not work in every practice, it's one of many ways an IR group can wade into the red waters of PAD and come out with a win. They, too, are passionate about the do-everything mantra, which has allowed them to compete very successfully in such crowded areas as pain management. If you want more information, give Scott Schultz or their CEO, Troy Ruvers, a call. These guys know all about competing and winning. I'm sure each of you could give me a competitive success story from your own practice. That's because we're all great competitors. We do great things for our patients, and we're great at what we do. Well, this brings me to the book I enjoyed most while researching this talk, Good to Great by Jim Collins. To be honest, before my CEO, Brother Matt, suggested I read this one, I'd never even heard of Jim Collins. But if I'd gone into business, this is the way I would have wanted to look at the world. He's done actual research into multiple areas of business. In this particular case, looking at 28 companies, 11 of which had substantially outpaced the market in a sustained way. Well, not surprisingly, leadership was among the key findings. But two other key findings resonated with me in light of this talk and our world. The first of these is something he calls the Stockdale paradox, after Admiral Jim Stockdale, a Vietnam War POW, who was held in brutal conditions and repeatedly tortured, yet made it home alive. He credits his survival to his never losing faith in the end of the story. He also says that the ones who didn't make it home were the optimists. In explaining this apparent paradox, he says, one must never confuse the unwavering faith that you will prevail in the end with the discipline to confront the brutal facts of your current reality. Wow. Well, that sounds pretty familiar. And it's that unwavering faith in IR, coupled with your society and all of you taking the necessary steps to confront the brutal facts, that has brought us, competitors that we are, to this very positive juncture. As an example of the Stockdale paradox, he uses the paper industry, where giant Procter & Gamble decided to get into the consumer products business. Scott Paper and Kimberly-Clark took two completely different approaches. The Scott Paper took a duck and cover, or you might say a blue water approach, whereas Kimberly-Clark said, bring it on. And as a result, they got better and stronger, and they were one of the 11 winners in Collins' book. They had that unwavering faith in the end of the story, whereas clearly Scott Paper did not. And the quote teaches us so much about the value of competition. The second key point was something he calls the hedgehog concept. And when I saw this, I thought, this defines IR in every way, both our blessing and our curse. The name is based on a Greek saying that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. In short, while the fox thinks up all sorts of clever ways to attack the hedgehog, when he finally does, the hedgehog rolls into a ball of spikes and once again the fox is foiled. All of the winning companies in Collins' book were hedgehogs, becoming the best in the world at what they did, driven by a passion to do so. Importantly, they also understood what they could not be best at. Now you might ask, well, are we the fox or the hedgehog? And to some extent, in our jack-of-all-trades IR world, we've been the fox, sometimes even the fox in the henhouse. But in Collins' analysis, the winners were all hedgehogs. So why did this resonate with me? When I look at those areas in IR where we've successfully competed rather than dominating blue water, we've all been hedgehogs. Those competitors, some of whom I mentioned already, have been truly passionate about what they do. But hey, aren't we all passionate about IR? And furthermore, some of our competitors are just as passionate about the things that we do. So it's not just about the passion. Looking at the economic engine part, it's true that some of the things we want to do more of reimburse well. But some of the other things we want to do more of don't. It's not just about the money. Last, there are many, if not most, things in IR that we are unquestionably the best in the world at. And while this has only been proven in a scientific way rarely, it has been done. But the hedgehog concept is the nexus of those three circles. We all can be hedgehogs, some of us already are hedgehogs, and we all should be hedgehogs, at least in those areas in which we wish to compete successfully. I'll come back to how we do that in a moment. Another famous business case relating to medicine used in MBA programs is the Shouldice Hospital in Toronto. This hospital specializes in doing only one thing, hernia repair. In fact, only external hernias. The surgery is heavily standardized, and they will only hire surgeons who will do it exactly their way, the so-called Shouldice repair. The hospitalization itself is also heavily standardized, with a long 3-night hospitalization, and is designed to maximize recovery. Patients walk pretty much everywhere, to the cafeteria and even back to their room after surgery. Nursing ratios are low because patients do much of their own care, even making their own beds. They pay the docs better there than others in the immediate area, even though the surgery is actually cheaper, because they could do this by volume. The hospital is always full, and they never have to advertise. If their competitors advertise, they call it the Canadian method. There's that imitation again, and tout no hospitalization as if that's a benefit. Without going into further detail, the reason the Shouldice Hospital is so famous is they have a 99.5% lifetime success rate. These guys are literally the best in the world at what they do. When I need my hernia repaired, this is where I'm going. These guys have the hedgehog concept figured out. Well, what these examples say to me is that if we want to compete and win in at least some of these areas, some degree of subspecialization is going to be necessary. In all of the high-functioning practices I interviewed, there was at least some degree of this, some more than others. Some practices, Mallinckrodt for example, have been way ahead of the curve in this, being subspecialized as far back as the 1990s. In our practice, we moved from an everyone does everything mantra in 2001 to a much more subspecialized one now. We have one person who does all of our endo leaks, one person who does nearly all of our UFE, and only a handful who do PAD. If I'm referred a patient now with PAD, I send it to one of my partners, not because I don't like doing PAD, but rather because I've chosen to refine my practice in other areas. In a similar vein, I stopped doing IO over 10 years ago. There are other areas, call them commodity areas if you want, venous access and drainage are good examples, where we all need to continue to be involved due to call needs, geographic distribution, and the like. But here too we can learn from business. In an essay entitled Predators and Prey by James Moore, used by the Wharton program, he talks about a business ecosystem and uses Walmart as an example of dominating a highly competitive field. There are a lot of lessons for IR here, as you can see, including the self-renewal one that we've been so good at. But if we want to compete successfully in these commodity areas, we need to do all of this. We need to offer perfect customer service, which we can do if we set our minds to it, perfect clinical results, which we can definitely do, QA and publishing leadership, and close interaction with hospital administration, as was so eloquently discussed by Bob Curlin last year. The quote tells us everything. This leads me to the inevitable conclusion that our evolution to hedgehogs will come from subspecialization. Now that the IR-DR is a reality, it's already time to start crafting the IR fellow of the future, namely subspecialty training following an IR-DR residency, similar to medicine. The obvious choices will be IO, PAD, and women's medicine, but there will be others as well. Thromboembolic disease, maybe vascular malformations, who knows? The point is that by staying on course as a cohesive group, with all of us doing some things and subspecializing in others, we can train and be truly great competitors. In one of my interviews with the leader from Boston Scientific, John Crowley, he challenged me to provide a vision for IR, so here it is. A common set of core skills learned in an IR-DR residency that everyone does well, perfectly delivered a la Walmart, Costco, or Southwest, coupled with IR subspecialty skills learned in a fellowship. We need to decide what we want, what we need, and what we're willing to walk away from, all the while keeping an eye on the ecosystem and the competition. Now, I hope by now I've convinced you that we really are good competitors and we can do whatever we set our collective minds to. There will undoubtedly be some naysayers. It's true that not all playing fields are level, and that what works will vary from practice to practice. As we move forward, we need to continue to hone our competitive edge, and we can take at least some cues from industry in that regard. To that end, let's come back to our mystery case, the Cola Wars. This Harvard Business School case starts with a quote shown from a former Pepsi CEO. I love this quote. I think it teaches us so much about the value of competition. To make a long story short, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola were invented in the late 1800s. Coke dominated early on, so much so that by 1900 it was being copied constantly. In 1916 alone, Coke, there were 160 imitations of Coke introduced. Coke responded with protectionist lawsuits, which worked for a while. Through the 20s and 30s, Coke continued to dominate. Pepsi actually went bankrupt twice. In 1938, Coke again sued Pepsi, but this time, in 1941, Pepsi won. They capped this win with an aggressive marketing campaign, including the famous 1963 Pepsi Generation ads, and gradually doubled their market share from 1950 to 1970. During this time, Coke executives wouldn't even mention Pepsi by name. Sort of sounds like Voldemort. Until one day, in 1979, it was uttered inadvertently and in exasperation by the Coke president at that time. This happened because Pepsi had gained a 1.4% market share lead over Coke for the first time ever. They'd gotten there with the 1974 Pepsi Challenge. The Cola Wars raged on. Coke roared back in 1982 with Diet Coke, which I really don't like, by the way, but you know. And they put them right back on top. New Coke, on the other hand, was a debacle, but they just bounced, they just shrugged it off. The 1990s brought further changes in taste, non-carbonated beverages, and bottled water, a reminder that change is guaranteed. Well, as you can see, things have stabilized for quite some time now. And importantly, Coke's back on top, but there's good market share for both Coke and Pepsi, even after creative destruction and disruptive technology have taken their toll. Well, I hope you'll agree that this is more or less perfect analogy to IR. But I ask you, are we Coke or are we Pepsi? Who do we want to be? I would argue that it doesn't matter, and return your attention to the quote on the slide. Competition makes us better. Now, you really didn't think I'd finish without mentioning research, did you? Research can be a very effective competitive and marketing tool. I also haven't said much about advertising, although I did obtain from an ad agency a back-of-the-envelope estimate for a campaign to take us from the 2% recognition we supposedly have now to 25%. Well, that would cost about $80 million, or about $15,000 per member. Maybe we want to do that. On the other hand, publishing's free. Obviously, outcomes research and randomized trials are best, but anything we can do to get the IR name out there helps. All publishing is great marketing. Just take a look at Google hits the next time you publish a paper. Incidentally, our competitors know this and are in the process of republishing a lot of work that we've done over the last couple of decades. Different specialty, different journal, same results. Now, publishing in other specialties journals is an even better competitive approach. We've done a little bit of this, but we need to do a lot more. And incidentally, Charles Doddard did a whole lot of this. Last and not least, let's not forget how we got here. There's still lots of blue water out there, and that's still a great competitive strategy. These are but a few of the exciting examples. Some that are going to pan out, and other ones won't. And you can bet we'll compete in all of them. As we mourn Joe Roche, who spent a huge amount of time with Charles Doddard, I think his words are particularly relevant here. Well, it's time to finish up. Alan asked me to give you some take-home points, so here they are. I think they're self-explanatory. I also want to point out that in business school, the cases are used to stimulate discussion. And I hope the cases I've presented here today will do just that. So many people helped me with this talk and in my career, I want to give them credit. I'm going to do so Hollywood style as I wrap up. At the end of the day, as they say in business, once we establish a relationship with a patient, medicine is no longer a business, but is about the quality of care that we render for that individual patient. It is that, at that time, it is our great fortune as healers to have that patient put their faith in us, knowing we will do everything in our power to make them better. Because of all the great tools we have, the skills we possess, and all the good we do, being an interventional radiologist is not only personally and professionally satisfying, it's just downright fun. When you love what you do, it's easy to get up to go to work in the morning. Never once have I thought twice about my decision to become an interventional radiologist, and I suspect neither of you. That's a wonderful thing. Thank you so much.